My mother-in-law pointed straight at me across the Thanksgiving dinner table and told me to take my daughter and get out of her house. Not quietly, not as a comment she might later pretend was a joke. She stood up in front of every person who had gathered there for the long weekend, pressed her finger toward the front door, and said it loud enough that the dog scrambled off the mat in the hallway. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not right then. I pulled my daughter up from her high chair, tucked her against my shoulder, and walked out into the cold October rain. I was certain it would be the last Thanksgiving any of us ever spent together. What I didn't know was that I'd left something behind. A small handmade photo book sitting quietly in the pile of gifts by the coat rack. And less than an hour after I drove away, that book would bring my mother-in-law to her knees in front of everyone she loved. My name is Verity. I'm 32 years old. 14 months before that October long weekend, my husband Holt was killed in a collision on the 401 outside Milton. It was a February morning, freezing rain. He was on his way to work. Our daughter Clem was 8 months old at the time. She had just started pulling herself up on the furniture and laughing at her own reflection in the oven door. Holt used to crouch down beside her and make faces at himself too, and she would shriek with delight every single time, like it was the first time she'd ever seen it. Losing him didn't break me cleanly, the way people sometimes describe grief. It was more like the floor dropped out, but the walls stayed standing, and for a long time I just wandered around a house that still had his coat on the hook and his half-empty mug in the dish rack. I was a dental hygienist working 4 days a week, paying our mortgage in Kitchener, raising a baby who had her father's dark eyes and his stubborn streak, and I was doing it alone. I'm not saying that for sympathy. I'm saying it because understanding where I was makes it easier to understand why I kept going back, month after month, to a house where I was never quite made to feel welcome. Holt's family lived about 2 hours west, near Goderich, on the eastern shore of Lake Huron. His mother, Dorothea, had always been particular. She had opinions about how things were done, and she was never shy about sharing them. But before Holt died, we'd managed. She and I weren't close, but we were civil. There were good visits. She taught me how to make Holt's favorite butter tarts the way his grandmother used to. She cried at our wedding in a way that felt genuine. I believed that we would be okay. After the accident, everything shifted. Dorothea became someone I barely recognized. Not in the obvious ways. She didn't shout at me in those early months. She just grew cold. She started arriving at family dinners and looking past me instead of at me. Started making comments that were shaped like questions but had teeth. Had I found a grief counselor for Clem yet? Because she'd read somewhere that babies could be affected by a mother's prolonged sadness. Was I sure Kitchener was the right city for us? Now that Holt wasn't there to help carry the mortgage, was there a reason I hadn't thought to call on what would have been their anniversary? Once, when I brought Clem to visit and she reached for a framed photo of Holt on the side table, Dorothea lifted it up out of her reach before I could say anything. Not gently. Just lifted it away and set it somewhere higher, where little hands couldn't get to it. She didn't explain why. I stayed. I kept showing up, not because I was naive. I knew exactly how those visits felt. But Clem deserved to know her father's family, and I genuinely believed, that if I just kept being patient and kind, something would eventually soften. That's the thing about hope. It doesn't always make you strong. Sometimes it just makes you stubborn. When Thanksgiving came around that October, I told myself this visit would be different. Holt's family was gathering for the long weekend. His parents, his sister Lottie and her husband, a few cousins, his father Gil's brother from Windsor. And I packed carefully. I made the maple-glazed sweet potato casserole that had become my contribution every year since Holt and I got together. I bought thoughtful gifts, and I packed tucked carefully beneath Clem's clean change of clothes and a box of teething crackers, a small handmade photo book I had been working on for weeks. The book was Clem's first year in photographs. Month by month, printed and arranged in a cream-colored album with her name stamped on the front. I'd stayed up past midnight to finish it. The last page held a photo I'd almost not included. Holt in the delivery room, holding Clem for the first time, his face completely undone with joy, his head tilted sideways the exact way Clem now tilted hers when she was curious about something. Below the photo, I had written a short note as though it came from her. It said, "Grandma, Daddy couldn't stay, but he left me so you'd still have a piece of him. I have his nose, and his stubborn streak, and I love you even when you're grumpy, Clem." I read it 3 times before I sealed the book. I thought it might reach something in Dorothea that my own words never had. We arrived on the Saturday afternoon. The maple trees along the county road had gone fully orange and red by then, and Clem was pressed against the car window, pointing at them with great seriousness the entire drive. When we pulled into the driveway, she spotted the dog through the screen door and started making the sound she always made for animals. A kind of high urgent humming, and for a moment, standing in that yellow October light, everything felt almost possible. The casserole was received with a comment about whether I'd remembered not to oversalt it this time. I set it on the counter and said nothing. The first hour passed the way those visits always did, politely, carefully, with conversation that stayed close to safe topics. The cousins were kind. Lottie hugged Clem and called her a little pumpkin, and spun her around until she giggled. Gil, Holt's father, held Clem on his lap during the football game, and looked so quietly grateful that it ached to watch him. He never said anything difficult to me. He just wasn't the one who set the tone. Dorothea moved through the house in that way she had, commenting, adjusting, directing, and every time she passed me there was something. My hair looked like I hadn't had time to bother with it. The little cardigan I'd put on Clem was sweet, but wasn't she cold enough in just that? One of Holt's cousins had brought his new girlfriend, and Dorothea spent 10 minutes telling me how accomplished she was. Worked in finance in Toronto, always so polished. She said it with a smile, looking directly at me. I focused on Clem. She was toddling between rooms, dragging a rubber duck she'd adopted from the bin of old bath toys in the spare bathroom. And every time someone crouched down to say hello to her, I felt a small, determined surge of love that steadied me. I could survive this. I'd done it before. Dinner was set out on the long table in the dining room. Turkey, stuffing, roasted squash, a cranberry sauce from a jar that Dorothea had been making since before Holt was born and would not hear any comment about. I settled into my chair with Clem in the high chair beside me, and for a little while the meal moved along quietly. People reached across each other for the bread rolls. Gil made a joke nobody could quite follow. Lottie refilled glasses and kept catching my eye across the table with the small apologetic look she always gave me. The one that said, "I know, I see it, I'm sorry, I never know what to do." Then Gil's brother leaned forward and looked at Clem, who was studying her fork with tremendous concentration. He said she had Holt's brow. You could see it right there. Same look he had when he was figuring something out. He said it warmly, as a gift. Several people around the table murmured in agreement. I felt my throat tighten the way it still did, 14 months later, whenever someone said something true about Holt. I looked at Clem and thought, yes, that's exactly right. And then I looked at Dorothea. Her hands had found the edge of the table. She was looking at Clem, and something in her face had shifted into a hardness I recognized, but always hoped I was reading wrong. She spoke slowly at first. She said it seemed like every time I brought Clem to these gatherings, the conversation always turned the same way. She said she'd been watching it for months. That Clem was being used. She used that word, used, to keep a place for me in a family I didn't belong to on my own anymore. That every holiday had become another ceremony of grief she hadn't been given a say in, and that I was the reason this family couldn't start finding its way forward. The table went very quiet. I said her name once gently. I said that wasn't what was happening. She looked at me the way you look at something you've decided to be done with. Then she stood up, and her chair scraped back on the hardwood, and she pointed toward the front door, the way someone points at a highway exit. She told me to take my daughter and get out of her house. She said neither of us was welcome there anymore. Clem startled at the sound of the chair and reached for me with both arms. I stood up. I lifted my daughter. I looked around the table at people who were looking at their plates, at the table runner at the window. Anywhere that wasn't the space between me and the woman who had just said those words out loud. Lottie's eyes were full. Gil had gone very still. Nobody spoke. I picked up the diaper bag from beside my chair. I thanked everyone for dinner. I walked out of the dining room, through the front hall, past the coat rack where I'd hung Clem's coat, and the bag with the gifts and the photo book inside, and out the front door into the October evening. It was raining. One of those cold, thin Ontario rains that doesn't make a sound until you're standing in it. I buckled Clem into her car seat, and she looked up at me with Holt's dark eyes, wide, taking everything in, not yet old enough to understand what she'd just witnessed. I pulled her blanket up around her and kissed the top of her head. Then I closed the door, sat down in the driver's seat and cried. Not the quiet, controlled kind. The kind that takes over your whole face for a few minutes, and then just stops. By the time I pulled out of the driveway, Clem had fallen asleep. I drove east on the county road, through towns still dressed in fall color, past farms and grain elevators, and the occasional Tim Hortons with its lights glowing through the rain. I stopped at one, somewhere between Goderich and Stratford, and sat in the parking lot with a medium coffee and Clem sleeping in the back seat. I sat there long enough to watch 2 other cars pull in and leave again. At some point, I started thinking about what I'd left behind. I'd left all the wrapped gifts in the pile by the coat rack. I'd left the sweet potato casserole, and I'd left the photo book. Clem's whole first year in photographs. The picture of Holt holding her for the first time. I thought about turning around. I even put the car in reverse and sat there for a moment, staring at the coffee in my hand. Then I thought, no. If someone could look at their 18-month-old granddaughter and tell her to get out, they didn't deserve that book. I'd worked on it for weeks. I'd chosen every photograph. I'd written that note with so much hope it embarrassed me now, a little. I pulled back into the parking space and drove toward home. Back at the house, the table had not been cleared. Nobody seemed to want to be the first to move. The leftover turkey sat in the middle. The candles had burned lower. The room had the particular weight of a space where something irreversible had just happened. Lottie was the one who found the bag by the coat rack. She went to get her jacket and saw the whole pile. Gifts, Clem's extra socks, the small cream-colored book tucked under the flap. She picked it up and looked at the cover, Clem's first year. She brought it into the dining room. She set it quietly in Dorothea's hands, and said it looked like it had been left behind, that it seemed like it was meant for her. Dorothea took it the way you take something when you're not sure you want it. She held it in her lap for a moment without opening it. Around her the table was completely still. She opened the cover. Clem's handprint was pressed on the first page in light blue ink, below it in my handwriting, "For Grandma Dorothea from Clem, October." Page by page, Dorothea went through the photographs. Clem in the hospital, red-faced and brand new. Clem in the stroller at the Kitchener market on a bright spring morning. Clem asleep on Holt's chest. That photo taken 3 weeks before he died, one of the last I had of them together. Clem learning to stand using the coffee table, laughing at something off camera. Dorothea turned to the last page. The photograph of Holt in the delivery room was on the right side, his head tilted, his face completely open. On the left was the note, and it was Lottie who read it aloud because Dorothea's voice had already stopped working. "Grandma, Daddy couldn't stay, but he left me so you'd still have a piece of him. I have his nose and his stubborn streak, and I love you even when you're grumpy. Clem." Nobody moved. Dorothea pressed the book against her chest the way you press something you're terrified of dropping. Her shoulders drew in, and then she cried. Not the way people cry when they're sad, but the way they cry when something true has been held inside them for a very long time, and has finally found its way out. Gil stood and put his hand on her back without saying anything. After a long moment, Lottie spoke. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She said she had something she needed to tell her mother. That she had been watching what happened to me and to Clem over the past year. That she had heard the comments. That she had watched me arrive at every visit trying. Genuinely trying. And leave looking smaller than when I'd come. That she had told herself it wasn't her place to interfere. That she hadn't wanted to start an argument that might make things worse. That she was ashamed of that now. Gil's brother said that he had felt the same way. That he had watched and said nothing at more than one visit over the past year, and that the silence hadn't been neutral. It had been permission. One of the cousins said quietly that none of them had stepped in, and they all knew why, and knowing why didn't make it right. Each admission cost something. That was clear, but there they were, saying it anyway, in the wreckage of a Thanksgiving dinner that had gone wrong, because the alternative, pretending the evening had been normal, was no longer possible. Dorothea listened without interrupting. She had not let go of the photo book. When everyone had gone quiet, she said, very softly, that she had told herself she was protecting her grief. That if she kept me at a distance, somehow Holt's absence wouldn't feel like something she needed to explain or perform for anyone. That she had blamed me for things. The move to Kitchener, the route he drove that morning, the way his life had quietly shifted away from his hometown. Because grief had needed somewhere to land and I had been standing right there. She said she had not let herself see Clem clearly. That she had looked at her granddaughter and seen a reason I would always have a claim on this family, instead of seeing what was actually there, the last living piece of her son. She said she had been so foolish, just that, and then she stopped talking. The drive back to Kitchener was quiet except for the rain and Clem's small sleeping sounds from the back seat. I got home just after 9. I carried Clem in, changed her into her pajamas without waking her fully, and laid her in her crib. She sighed and curled onto her side, and one tiny fist opened and closed once, the way it always did when she was settling. I stood in the dark for a long while. I thought about all the parking lots I had sat in over the past 14 months. All the times I had talked myself back into patience and kindness and one more visit. I had spent over a year believing that if I just kept arriving at that door with something good, eventually something good would be given back. Standing there listening to Clem breathe, I finally understood that wasn't how it worked. You could offer kindness endlessly. That was still a choice worth making for its own sake, but you couldn't make someone receive it. You couldn't patience your way into being accepted. All you could do was decide what you were going to protect, and then protect it. I looked at my daughter sleeping and I made her a promise that nobody would ever make her earn her place in a room, not from me, not from anyone we chose to let into our lives from this point forward. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, someone knocked at the side door. I looked through the glass and saw my mother-in-law standing on the back step in a rain jacket, holding something wrapped carefully in brown paper. Her car was parked at the curb. She had driven 2 hours without calling first, which told me something. I opened the door. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. The particular exhaustion of someone who has had to sit with something they caused. She held out the wrapped package before she said anything else. Inside was the photo book. She had taken the last page, and the note, and had it framed. A simple maple wood frame. She'd had it done at a shop in Goderich, she said, because she wanted it protected, not put away, displayed. Then she said she was not there to ask me for forgiveness on a timeline. She was not going to explain her grief to me as if grief were an excuse for what she'd done. She was there to say she had been wrong, that what she had said at the dinner table had been cruel and without justification. That what she had been doing for the past 14 months had been cruel, too. And she had known it. And she had kept doing it anyway because she had not been willing to feel what was underneath it. She said she would understand if I needed time. She said she would understand if I needed more than time. I thought about how easy it would be to close the gap right then. To say it's okay, the way you sometimes say it's okay when what you mean is I don't want to have this conversation anymore. There's a version of forgiveness that's really just exhaustion wearing a kinder face. I didn't say that. I told her that I believed she was sorry, that there was a difference between forgiving someone and trusting them, and I knew which one I was able to offer right now, and it was not the second one. She nodded without arguing. I told her that Clem had a right to know her father's mother, that I wanted that for her genuinely, not out of obligation, but because Clem deserved all the people who carried pieces of Holt with them. But every visit going forward would happen because it was healthy for Clem. Not because anyone felt entitled to access. That the first time I felt my daughter looking to me to see if she was safe, we would leave, and there would not be a conversation about it. My mother-in-law said she understood. She did not ask for a hug. She did not suggest a date before she left. She thanked me for opening the door and walked back to her car and drove away. The months that followed were not seamless. There were visits that ended earlier than planned because something felt off. And I honored those instincts without apologizing for them. There were moments when old patterns surfaced and I named them plainly, and my mother-in-law pulled back, corrected, and tried again. It was not a transformation. It was more like a long, slow realignment, two people deciding to deal in honesty instead of damage. But she showed up. Every time we agreed on a visit, she was there, on time, with her full attention on Clem. She brought maple shortbread because she learned it was Clem's favorite. She got down on the floor for puzzles. She read the same board book 6 times in a row without once checking her phone. When Clem started calling her by a name she'd invented herself, something that sounded vaguely like Dodo, my mother-in-law answered to it without missing a beat, with a face full of quiet delight. The framed page sits on her mantel now. I've seen it every visit since. The photograph of Holt, his head tilted, Clem a few hours old in his arms, the note below in my handwriting. She has never once moved it or explained it to anyone. It simply sits there, in plain sight, where she can see it in the morning and when she turns out the lights at night. It isn't decoration, it's a reminder. Of the evening when a few sentences written for a baby did what 14 months of patient kindness couldn't do on its own. Not because kindness had been wrong, but because some truths can only land when someone is finally ready to stop running from them. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest thing I did that October had nothing to do with the photo book. I made it with love, and it mattered. But that wasn't the victory. The victory was getting in the car, driving away into the rain without begging anyone to change their mind. Coming home to my daughter and deciding, in the quiet of her room, that my worth and hers were not up for negotiation. Forgiveness takes longer than an evening. Trust takes longer than an apology. And a family, a real one, the kind worth having, isn't built on shared blood or holiday tables or the weight of obligation. It's built on the small daily choice to show up with honesty and to treat the people you love like they deserve to stay. Clem is almost 3 now. She asks about her daddy sometimes, in the way toddlers ask about things, directly, without softening it. I tell her the truth in words she can hold, that he loved her before she was born, that he would have been so proud of who she's becoming, that he left a lot of himself behind, in the people around her and in the face she sees in the mirror. She tilts her head when she listens, just the way he did. And somewhere in this city, and on a shore 2 hours west of here, the people who love her are learning, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, to deserve the place they're being given in her life. That is the only kind of family I ever wanted for her. And it turns out, it was worth every hard thing it took to find our way there. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you're new to Family Shadows, please subscribe. We share stories like this one every week.